Aisha Carter walked down the quiet street, her backpack slung over one shoulder. It was late, but she wasn't worried. She had just spent hours studying at her best friend's house, preparing for an important college exam. The night air was cool, and she enjoyed the peaceful silence. Her long, curly black hair flowed down her back, moving slightly with the breeze. As she neared the corner, bright red and blue lights flashed behind her. Aisha turned around, surprised to see a police car pulling up next to her. The doors opened, and two female officers stepped out. One was tall with sharp features, her uniform neat and crisp. The other had short blonde hair and a serious look on her face. "Stop right there," the tall officer said, her tone firm. Aisha froze, confused. She had done nothing wrong. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked politely. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," the blonde officer said, walking closer. "Where are you coming from?" Aisha frowned. "I was just studying at my friend's house. I live a few blocks away. You can call her if you want to check." The officers exchanged a look. The tall one, whose badge read Officer Karen Walsh, folded her arms. "That's what they all say." Aisha's heart started beating faster. Something about their tone made her uneasy. "I can show you my ID," she offered, reaching into her backpack slowly. But before she could take it out, the blonde officer, Officer Deborah Simmons, grabbed her arm. "Hands where we can see them," she ordered. Aisha was shocked. "Wait, I'm just getting my ID," she protested. "You need to cooperate," Officer Walsh said, stepping closer, "or this will get worse for you." Aisha swallowed hard. Why were they treating her like this? She had always been taught to respect the police. But right now, she felt like no matter what she said, they had already made up their minds about her. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, trying to stay calm. "Please, call my dad. He's—" "Enough," Officer Simmons interrupted. She reached for her radio. "We have a possible suspect. Taking her in for questioning." Aisha's eyes widened. This wasn't right. They weren't even listening to her. "Wait. At least let me call my dad." "You'll get one phone call when we say so," Walsh snapped. Before Aisha could say another word, they'd pulled her hands behind her back. Cold metal cuffs locked around her wrists. A sinking feeling filled her chest. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. They weren't going to let her go. As they pushed her towards the police car, she looked around desperately, hoping someone would see what was happening. But the street was empty. The only sound was the hum of the police radio and the soft rustle of the trees in the night wind. Her heart pounded. She had no idea that this night would change her life forever. The ride to the police station felt longer than it should have. Aisha sat in the back seat, her wrists still locked in the cold metal cuffs. She tried to keep herself calm, but her hands were shaking. She had never been in trouble before. She had never even gotten a parking ticket. Why was this happening? Officer Walsh and Officer Simmons sat in the front, talking as if she wasn't even there. Every now and then, they glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Aisha could feel their eyes on her, like they were already sure she was guilty of something. "I don't understand," Aisha said, her voice steady but nervous. "What exactly do you think I did?" Neither officer answered right away. Finally, Officer Walsh sighed and said, "Like we told you, you fit the description of someone we're looking for. If you're innocent, you'll be free to go." Aisha wanted to believe that, but something about their tone didn't feel right. She had seen news stories about things like this happening, but she never thought she would be the one sitting in the back of a police car, being treated like a suspect for no reason. When they reached the station, Officer Simmons opened the door and gestured for Aisha to step out. As soon as she did, they held her arms and guided her inside. The bright lights and the sound of ringing phones filled the air. A few other officers glanced at her, but none of them seemed interested in what was happening. Aisha looked around, hoping to find someone who would listen to her, someone who would believe her. "Please, can I call my dad now?" "You'll make your call later," Officer Walsh interrupted. For now, we need to process you. Aisha felt a lump form in her throat. Process her. That sounded like they were planning to keep her here longer. She took a deep breath, trying to stay strong. This had to be a mistake. It had to be. The officers led her down a hallway and into a small room. It was cold and empty except for a desk, a chair, and a bench against the wall. Take off your shoes and empty your pockets, Officer Simmons instructed. Aisha hesitated. I really don't understand why this is necessary, she said. Do as you're told, Walsh said, her voice sharp. Slowly, Aisha removed her shoes and took out the few things she had. Her phone, her student ID, a few dollars. The officers bagged them without a word. Then came the moment that made Aisha's stomach drop. Officer Simmons walked over with a pair of clippers in her hand. Sit down, she said. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. What? Why? New policy, Walsh said. Certain detainees have to have their hair cut for safety reasons. Aisha's eyes filled with tears. They couldn't be serious. You can do this the easy way, Simmons said, stepping closer, or we can do it for you. Aisha wanted to fight back, to scream, to demand someone stop this. But as she looked around, she realized something horrible. No one was coming to help her. Aisha sat frozen in the chair, her heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. She had heard stories about unfair treatment, but she never thought she would experience it herself. She looked at the clippers in Officer Simmons' hand, then at Officer Walsh, who stood nearby with her arms crossed, watching. Her throat felt dry. You don't have to do this, Aisha said, her voice shaking but firm. This isn't right. My hair has nothing to do with any of this. Simmons sighed, as if Aisha was just another task to check off a list. It's the rules, she said. You can sit still and make this easy, or we can handle it another way. Aisha clenched her fists. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But what could she do? She was in their hands now. Please, she tried one more time. Just let me call my father. He'll explain everything. Walsh shook her head. Calls come later. Right now, we need to follow procedure. Aisha swallowed back tears. She had spent years caring for her hair, growing it out naturally, learning how to style and protect it. It was a part of her, a part of who she was. And now, these strangers, who didn't even know her, were going to take that away. She wanted to fight back, but deep down, she knew that resisting would only make things worse. With a shaky breath, she sat still as Simmons turned on the clippers. The loud buzzing filled the room, making her stomach twist in knots. The first cut was the hardest. Aisha felt the vibration against her scalp as pieces of her thick, beautiful hair began to fall to the floor. She shut her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that burned behind her lids. Neither officer said anything. No words of apology, no explanation, nothing. Just the cold, mechanical sound of the clippers, stripping away something that meant so much to her. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. When the buzzing finally stopped, the room was painfully silent. Aisha slowly opened her eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to look in the mirror on the wall. She could already feel the difference, the cool air against her bare scalp, the loss of something that had been hers for so long. Simmons stepped back, inspecting her work. That's better, she said, brushing off some stray hairs from Aisha's shoulders. Aisha didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, where dark curls lay scattered around her feet. It felt like a piece of her had been thrown away. Walsh grabbed a small bag and tossed it to Simmons. Put the hair in there. Evidence. Evidence. For what? Aisha's chest ached. They weren't just punishing her. They were trying to humiliate her. Take her to holding, Walsh ordered. Simmons nodded and reached for Aisha's arm, but Aisha didn't move. She just sat there, numb. They had taken her freedom. Now they had taken a part of her identity, too. And the worst part, they still didn't know who she really was. Captain James Carter sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. It was past midnight, and his daughter Aisha still hadn't come home. He had called her phone multiple times, but there was no answer. That wasn't like her. Aisha always let him know if she was going to be late. A deep sense of worry settled in his chest. He picked up his phone and checked her location tracker, something he had set up years ago, just in case. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the blinking dot. She was at the police station. James immediately stood up, grabbed his car keys, and rushed out of the house. His mind raced as he drove through the nearly empty streets. Why was Aisha at the police station? She wasn't the type to get into trouble. She was a college student, a kind-hearted girl who worked hard to achieve her dreams. The moment he pulled into the police station's parking lot, he stepped out of the car with a sense of authority. James Carter wasn't just any father. He was a high-ranking FBI agent. He had spent years serving his country, working on high-profile cases, and ensuring justice was served. As he walked through the front doors, the officers at the desk glanced up. Some of them recognized him instantly. They knew who he was. "I need to see my daughter," James said, his deep voice calm but commanding. The officer at the front desk hesitated. "Sir, who is your daughter?" "Aisha Carter," he said firmly. "She was brought here tonight. I want to know why." The officer's face paled slightly as he checked the system. James could already see the nervous shift in his body language. Something was wrong. Let me get the officer in charge," the man stammered before quickly disappearing into the back. James narrowed his eyes. Why did he seem so nervous? Minutes later, Officer Karen Walsh and Officer Deborah Simmons appeared. Their confident expressions from earlier were now replaced with discomfort. They had no idea who Aisha's father was when they arrested her. But now, standing in front of a senior FBI agent, they realized they had made a terrible mistake. James folded his arms. "Where is my daughter?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with authority. Walsh cleared her throat. "She's in holding, sir." "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," James repeated, his eyes cold. "You arrested my daughter, took away her rights, and humiliated her. And you call that a misunderstanding." Neither officer spoke. The weight of what they had done was sinking in fast. "Take me to her, now." With no other choice, Walsh and Simmons led him down the hallway. Every step James took, his anger grew. They were about to learn who they had messed with, and it was too late to undo their actions. James Carter walked down the cold hallway, his fists clenched. The tension in the air was thick. Officers Walsh and Simmons walked ahead of him, their shoulders stiff, their confidence from earlier completely gone. James wasn't just a father tonight. He was a man who had spent years enforcing the law, making sure justice was served. But now, his own daughter had become a victim of the very system he trusted, and he wasn't going to let it slide. When they reached the holding area, Simmons hesitated before unlocking the heavy metal door. The moment it opened, James' heart sank. There, sitting on a hard bench, was Aisha. Her head was down, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to disappear. But what broke James the most was when she slowly lifted her face. Her beautiful, thick curls, gone. Her deep brown eyes, usually full of life, were now filled with sadness and exhaustion. "Aisha," he breathed, stepping inside. The moment she saw him, her face crumpled. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaky. James rushed forward and pulled her into his arms. He could feel her shaking, could hear the quiet sniffles as she tried to hold back tears. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly. "I've got you." Behind them, Walsh and Simmons stood awkwardly, looking anywhere but at them. They knew they had made a huge mistake. James gently pulled back and looked at Aisha. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. Aisha swallowed hard. They shaved my hair, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They wouldn't let me call you. They said I fit a description, but they never listened to me." James felt a rage unlike anything he had ever known. He turned to the two officers, his expression dark. You arrested an innocent girl. You humiliated her. And you didn't even bother to check who she was before treating her like this. Walsh stammered. Sir, we. You what? James cut her off, his voice sharp. You thought you could get away with it, that no one would question it. Simmons cleared her throat nervously. We were just following protocol. Protocol, James repeated, his eyes blazing. Tell me exactly what protocol allows you to treat an innocent person like this. What rule says you can strip a young woman of her dignity without proof of a crime? Neither of them answered. They both knew there was no excuse for what they had done. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his anger. You have no idea who you just messed with, he said. But trust me, you're about to find out. Walsh and Simmons exchanged a nervous glance. For the first time, they realized their careers might be in serious danger, and it was too late to undo what they had done. James Carter stood tall, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were filled with fury. Aisha held onto his arm, still shaken, but now a glimmer of relief flickered in her eyes. Her father was here. She wasn't alone anymore. The room was silent, except for the nervous shuffling of Officers Walsh and Simmons. They had been so confident when they arrested Aisha, so sure of their authority. But now, standing before a high-ranking FBI agent, they looked uneasy. James turned toward the holding cell officer. Release her. Now. The officer hesitated, glancing at Walsh and Simmons as if waiting for instructions. But James wasn't in the mood for delays. Did you hear me? His voice was calm, but the weight behind it made everyone tense up. The officer fumbled with the keys and quickly unlocked the door. Aisha stepped out, and James immediately took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. He could feel how cold she was. How could they do this to his daughter? James then turned back to Walsh and Simmons. I want every detail of what happened tonight, he demanded. And I want it now. Simmons cleared her throat, her usual confidence gone. Sir, we were just doing our job. She fit the description of a suspect in a case we were handling. James' jaw clenched. And instead of verifying facts, instead of checking her identity, you arrested her, denied her a phone call, and, his voice lowered dangerously, you shaved my daughter's hair. Walsh finally spoke, trying to defend herself. It's a safety procedure for some detainees. Was she violent? Was she a threat? James cut her off. Walsh said nothing. James took a step closer. You humiliated an innocent young woman. You abused your power. And you treated my daughter like a criminal when you had no proof of wrongdoing. Simmons exhaled, as if she finally realized just how bad the situation was. Sir, we didn't know who she was. James let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I know you didn't. But here's the thing. You shouldn't have to know someone's connections to treat them with basic human decency. Would you have done this if she was someone else's daughter? A senator's? A judge's? Silence filled the room. Neither officer had an answer. James took a deep breath. You think this ends here? No, this is just the beginning. I'm filing official complaints. I'm going to ensure that an investigation is opened into your actions. And if you think this will go unnoticed, you are very, very wrong. The color drained from Walsh's face. Simmons swallowed hard. James placed a protective hand on Aisha's shoulder. Let's go, sweetheart. As they walked toward the exit, every officer in the station watched. The two women who had abused their power were finally realizing the consequences of their actions, and it was too late for them to escape it now. James Carter walked out of the police station with Aisha by his side. The cold night air hit them, but it felt nothing compared to the anger burning inside him. Aisha, wrapped in his jacket, held her head down, still feeling the weight of everything that had happened. James opened the car door for her. Get in, sweetheart. We're going home. As she sat in the passenger seat, she finally let out a deep breath. It felt like she had been holding it in for hours. James got behind the wheel, but before starting the car, he turned to her. Aisha, he said gently, I need you to tell me everything. I need every detail." She swallowed hard and nodded. "They stopped me on the street," she began. "They said I looked like someone they were looking for. I tried to explain, but they didn't listen." Her voice trembled. "They wouldn't even let me call you Dad. They just brought me in like I was guilty from the start." James clenched the steering wheel tightly. His knuckles turned white. They shaved my hair, Dad," Aisha whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "They said it was for safety, but I know it wasn't. They just wanted to humiliate me." James closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to control his emotions. His daughter had been mistreated in the worst way, and he was not going to let it slide. He finally started the car, his mind already working on what to do next. "We're not just going to file a complaint," he said firmly. "I'm taking this straight to internal affairs. I'll make sure those officers are held accountable." Aisha wiped her eyes and nodded. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said softly. James glanced at her, his heart aching for her. "It won't. I promise." When they got home, Aisha went straight to her room. She avoided looking in the mirror, not ready to face the reality of her shaved head. Instead, she curled up under her blanket, feeling both relieved and exhausted. Meanwhile, James sat at his desk, opening his laptop. He started typing an official report, gathering evidence, and making phone calls. As a senior FBI agent, he had connections, people who wouldn't ignore what had happened. By the next morning, the news had already started spreading. A high-ranking FBI agent's daughter had been wrongly arrested and mistreated by police officers. It was only a matter of time before the department would have to answer for what they had done. And as for Officers Walsh and Simmons, they were about to realize that their actions would have serious consequences.